Many people think freedom means the ability to do whatever we want, but the Catholic understanding of freedom is radically different. In this video, Bishop Barron explains it brilliantly to Michael Knowles, and his explanation might surprise you. Let's listen.
The meaning of freedom. Buckley, coming out of, I would say, the Catholic social teaching tradition, which then stretches way back, goes back to the medieval doctors, goes back to the fathers of the church and into the Bible itself. And it's opposed to this sort of freewheeling libertarianism, that liberty means I do what I want. No, it means a kind of disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good possible.
Yes.
You know, that would be John Paul II's sense of liberty. And I think, right, Buckley was coming out of that. And it sits comfortably to a degree in the American context if it's properly read. You know, and the founding fathers who insisted, of course, upon a moral structure to freedom, that's missing in a lot of the conversation today.
Well, there's a line from Lord Acton, which sometimes goes around, and Acton says, summarizing the Catholic view of freedom, he says, liberty is not the ability to do what we wish, but the right to do what we ought.
What we ought, yeah.
And when I say that...
And John Paul echoed that very much, John Paul II.
And by the way, it's not just Lord Acton. I mentioned Lord Acton because he still has cred with the libertarians. But it's not just Lord Acton, and it's not just John Paul II, and it's not just the Founding Fathers. This was the understanding of liberty going back to classical political philosophy, up through the Christians, up through Dante writes about this directly in Monarchia, up through Donoso Cortez and the beginning of the Counter-Enlightenment and conservatism, and up through the American tradition. This was the understanding of liberty. If you look at the Rhode Island Charter, 1666, I think it is, New York State Constitution, 1777, both of those documents state that the citizens cannot abuse their liberty to licentiousness. You know, the Founding Fathers, the framers of the Constitution, almost all of them wrote about this subject in almost those exact words.
Taking that for granted. That would have just been in their political unconscious, that idea.
Correct. And so now, really, since the 1960s, it's pretty recent, we've had this upending, this notion that liberty is totally disconnected, not only from the moral order, but from even tangible reality. That, you know, that a man can have the freedom to flap his wings and fly.
Right.
Catholicism understands freedom as the disciplining of desire so that the pursuit of the good becomes possible. In simple terms, we are not given freedom to do whatever we please, but to do the good we are called to do. This idea of freedom, not as chaos, but as ordered love, runs deep in the Christian tradition. As Dante reveals in the Divine Comedy, true freedom is not found in indulging every impulse, but in allowing our loves to be rightly ordered toward God. In the Purgatorio, the souls climbing the mountain are not being punished out of cruelty, they are being healed. Their disordered desires are purified until they began to love the right things in the right way and for the right reasons. This same truth doesn't just live in poetry. It's at the very heart of Scripture. The story of Exodus shows that God's act of liberation was never about mere escape, but about purpose. When he commands Pharaoh, "Let my people go," he adds, "so that they may worship me." Israel was not freed simply to do whatever it wanted, but to enter into covenant with God, to love, serve, and worship him. Their freedom found fulfillment not in wandering the desert, but in standing before Mount Sinai, where obedience and love gave their freedom meaning. In this sense, biblical freedom is always directional. It draws the human heart away from slavery to self and toward communion with the God who alone can make us truly free. But as centuries unfolded, this ancient and biblical understanding of freedom slowly began to erode. Philosophers and theologians started to redefine what freedom meant, and in doing so, they unknowingly shifted the moral landscape of Western civilization. In the next clip, Bishop Barron and Michael Knowles discuss how voluntarism, the idea that freedom means merely the power to choose, reshaped the Western mind and gave rise to the deeply flawed vision of what it means to be free in our world today. Let's listen.
And see, I would trace the roots back, because a lot of things that come up in the present day are revivals of very old issues. And this is the voluntarism of people like, go back to Duns Scotus, but especially William of Ockham. So in the late Middle Ages, when Aquinas' view is threatened, and this new view of freedom as self-determination, as sort of spontaneous self-determination comes to the fore. That's not Aquinas' view at all of freedom. What we were talking about is the Aquinas tradition, which is very ancient. But this new one had its roots back then, but yes, comes roaring out today for sure. You know, in the famous Regensburg address that got Pope Benedict in so much
I
trouble.
was just thinking of it when you were
But
describing it.
the point of that address, it was not really to address Islam. The point of that address was to battle voluntarism.
Yes.
And to speak in favor of logocentrism. When we say Jesus is the logos, but we're tying our freedom to that truth, to the word. And the danger of voluntarism in whatever form it takes, and there are forms of it within Christianity, Benedict said that is very dicey business, you know, because now freedom just becomes this sort of freewheeling, self-defining quality. Furthermore, any link that you and I might have is severed.
Yes.
Because you've got your private freedom, I got my private freedom. You define yourself the way you want, I do it the way I want. And all we can do is tolerate each other in some vague way.
Yes.
But any sense of like community or common good or shared purpose, all that's compromised.
Or shared perception of the world.
No, right. No, but that's the thing. Is when truth is bracketed to that degree, I can't even decide about my gender. Well, then it's open season on a sort of dissolution of the body politic.
Yes.
Right? I think that's what's threatening us in many ways today.
You know, you mentioned...
As Bishop Barron explains, voluntarism began with St. Augustine, who emphasized the will's role in loving God but kept it balanced with reason. Later thinkers like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham broke that harmony, claiming that things are good simply because God wills them. This idea, called divine voluntarism, separated God's will from his wisdom and paved the way for the Reformation, where Luther and Calvin stressed God's absolute control and humanity's lack of freedom. Over time, that theology evolved into the modern secular idea of freedom, not the freedom to do good, but the freedom to define your own truth. What started as a bad theology became the root of today's radical individualism. And that kind of freedom is really just another form of slavery, because when freedom loses its anchor in truth, it turns inward and collapses on itself. In the next clip, Bishop Barron shows how this thinking took deep root in the Protestant reformers. Let's listen.
You know, the Christian strength comes up through someone like Calvin, who
Yes.
would have inherited very much of a nominalist epistemology.
Yeah.
And you do have that uber-sovereign God who seems to hover above the yes and the no, above the good and the bad. Why are some people predestined for salvation, some predestined to damnation? Well, because God decided. It was God's will. That is a voluntarism. That is will run amok. Where in Aquinas, will and mind coincide because of God's simplicity. So God can't will arbitrarily.
Yes.
That famous question in the Summa when Thomas asks, can God sin? It's a very interesting question. Because if you're a voluntarist, it seems to me, the answer would be, well, yeah, sure, heck, I can sin.
Whatever he wants to.
And if I can sin, God, who's all power, why can't God sin? And Aquinas famously says, no, God can't sin because God can't be out of step with his own nature. And I know that sounds very arcane and like medieval theology. It's very relevant to the conversation today because our freedom is mimicking that voluntaristic freedom, right? And so, sure, I can decide what truth is. I'm not constrained by truth. My freedom isn't directed by truth. It determines truth.
Yes.
And that opens up abysses, as they say. And I think that is, to my mind, the greatest problem politically. It's got philosophical and theological roots, but it plays itself out on the streets today.
Well,
As Bishop Barron explains, there was this strong strand of voluntarism in the mind of Protestant reformers who believed that God's sovereignty was so total that human beings had no real freedom to cooperate with grace. Salvation depended solely on God's decision, not on any human participation. John Calvin pushed this even further through the doctrine of predestination, where everything is determined by God's will alone. This voluntarist mindset replaced the Catholic understanding of synergy between divine grace and human freedom with a vision of humanity as passive recipients of God's arbitrary choice. Over time, that way of thinking seeped into the broader culture, detaching freedom from truth and turning it into a kind of theological individualism, the roots of my will, my truth mentality that dominates today's world. And so we return to where we began. True freedom, as the church teaches, is not about doing whatever we want, but about becoming who we are created to be. As St. Thomas Aquinas beautifully put it, God wills things because they are good, rather than things being good because God wills them. That one line captures it all. Reason and will united, truth and love intertwined. It's a reminder that real freedom is not found in self-expression, but in self-gift, in learning to will what God wills, and in that discovering what it truly means to be free. I hope this video is helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. God bless you.